Hi there, John Wilkinson, History Made Easier. Having done a couple of videos on China's century of humiliation, the first looking at just how China was humiliated, the second looking at the Chinese people's response, I'm going to do a video on the young Mao and his response to China's humiliation, taking us from schoolboy Mao at the time of the 1911 revolution up to the point of the White Terror. I'm doing this because I think maybe it's not so well covered in some textbooks, and I think it will be useful context for you. I certainly hope you find it interesting anyway. So, Mao's early responses to China's century of humiliation. At the point of the revolution of 1911, Mao was still a teenager at school. He was nevertheless inspired to cut off his queue in a personal anti-Manchu protest, and forcibly cut off the queues of friends who had promised to join in the protest but had backed away from doing so. Mao was further radicalized by the May 4th movement. In his home province of Hunan, he called for a national boycott of Japanese goods and started a new journal, the Xiang River Review, to propagate the national revolution. At this point, his was a peaceful protest. We will not pursue that ineffectual revolution of bombs or revolution of blood, he wrote in the manifesto for the review. Mao's personal journey would be complex, and he went down a number of paths before he accepted Marxism as the ism that best served China's needs, the most likely to meet with success. But he became a Marxist, forming two groups in Hunan to spread Marxist thinking, training themselves as future party activists, and to organize strikes and general disruption amongst Hunan workers. And when the Chinese Communist Party was formed in Shanghai in July 1921, Mao was one of only 12 who was at the meeting. As for the United Front, Mao himself grudgingly saw the practical need for a temporary alliance, calling it the mother of revolution, the magic potion. In an analysis of all the classes in Chinese society, a pamphlet he wrote, he says, if the Chinese Revolution has achieved so little, the strategic error has consisted precisely in the failure to unite with real friends in order to attack real enemies. But he also called on CCP members to guard their independence so as to be ready to resume their leading role. Mao became increasingly convinced of the significance of the peasantry, declaring in January 1926 that China's national revolution is, to put it plainly, a peasant revolution. Then in early 1927, with the Northern Expedition in full swing, came Mao's report on the peasant movement in Hunan. By any definition, it was a major work, written only after numerous meetings in villages and county towns with leaders in the peasants' movement, not all of them party comrades, and supported with meticulously documented evidence. Mao described the peasantry as a force like fierce wind or tempest. It led him to switch from the reluctant role of subverting the socialist revolution in favour of the bourgeois national revolution to calling for the CCP to change its policy or it would become irrelevant. In a short time, several 100 million peasants will rise like a fierce wind or tempest. They will, in the end, send all the imperialists, warlords, corrupt officials, local bullies, and bad gentry to their graves. Mao's words. Mao pointed to the way in which the peasant associations were already attacking the local bullies, the bad gentry, and the lawless landlords, destroying the privileges they had enjoyed for thousands of years, reducing rents and interest rates on debts, ending hoarding that inflated grain prices, destroying their militias and replacing them with militias of their own, ending the influence of the clan and religious authorities too, so that their associations were now the sole organs of authority, the peasants' associations, that is. And they were also clamping down on opium smoking and gambling. Communists, he argued, had to decide whether they were with them or not. As it so happened, at much the same time as Mao's report was being digested by his CCP colleagues, a change of heart on the part of Stalin and the Comintern with regard to the peasantry was made known. They admitted to a profound mistake. Though the United Front was to be maintained, the agrarian revolution should not be ignored for fear of upsetting what was in any case an unreliable section of the capitalist class. And when Chiang Kai-shek unleashed the White Terror on the communists and their sympathisers, the Communist Party and their Comintern advisers were in total disarray, unsure how to respond. A bourgeois revolution before a revolution of the peasantry and workers was still the preference of some, including the Comintern. However, others saw this as collaborating with the forces of reaction, a betrayal of both peasants and workers. As well as being ideologically split, the communists were also physically splintered into three groups. The party leadership, who continued the battle from Shanghai, which became the headquarters of the CCP, those who continued the fight in the countryside amongst the peasantry, for example Mao, and Moscow and the Comintern, with representatives of the Comintern on the ground in China. Each was committed to the cause. Each wanted a socialist revolution. Each was brave. All this is beyond question. But each would have a different perspective on what was unfolding in China and a different perspective on reality. Adding to this already explosive cocktail, one can add the final ingredient: fiercely strong personalities and their delicate egos. So as each pushed their favoured policies, their favoured tactics, as the communists referred to it, their line, control of the direction of the revolution would take was constantly uncertain. Moscow, Shanghai, and Mao could not agree on whether they should play the leading role, defending what territory was held and adding to it when they could, or whether they should play a supportive role, responding to support insurrections initiated by peasants in the countryside or workers in the towns. Another key issue that was fiercely debated was whether the revolution should focus primarily on the workers and focus on taking control of towns, or would the revolution succeed first in the countryside, and only then would the towns fall into their hands? And what tactics should their armies adopt? Should they disperse and conduct a flexible guerrilla campaign, or should they consolidate their forces and build bases from which the revolution could spread? This too was the focus of fierce debate. And these debates were conducted as the White Terror raged around them, as they suffered terrible setbacks and faced the most incredible odds. All of which meant that attempts to resist and fight back, 8 areas were chosen for the fight back to begin, only added to their losses and made survival less certain. The autumn harvest uprising in Hunan in 1927, led by Mao but not entirely controlled by him, was one such failure. Though Mao was denied the military support he requested, Mao was nevertheless criticised, accused of military adventurism, and removed from both the Politburo and the Hunan Provincial Committee, though he continued to lead his men. The most critical lesson learned from the White Terror was the importance of military power if political objectives were to be achieved. The lessons of Sun Yat-sen and the 1911 revolution, the warlords and Chiang Kai-shek, and most painfully the White Terror, all pointed to the fact that military struggle and so an army would be the only means by which a socialist revolution could be achieved in China. So grew the Maoist maxim, political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. Mao had come to this conclusion at the planning stage of the autumn harvest uprising, only to be thwarted by the party leadership, who placed popular insurrection before military force. Armies would only be used to consolidate the gains of the peasants. And so they accused him of a lack of faith in the masses. In the wake of the failed uprising, Mao also concluded that the peasantry needed leadership, not from bourgeois landlords, which was the case in the uprising, but from officers trained by the party. The party had to be a political party and an army too. But despite the overwhelming failure of the insurrections, the party persisted in supporting uprisings, all of which failed. Of necessity, units such as Mao's operated with a degree of operational autonomy, which could result in clashes with the leadership in Shanghai. Zhou Enlai, who by this stage was head of the party's military committee, was a stickler for party discipline and towing the party line. And as Mao was building his army in Jinggangshan, in the mountains of Hunan, Zhu stood opposed to both his tactics and his independent spirit. His troops had a bandit character, he railed. He accused Mao of military opportunism, that he did not trust in the strength of the masses. a directive that reached Mao and for which Zhu was most likely responsible for, accused him of serious political errors. For his part, Mao constantly bemoaned the fact that the party leadership in Shanghai had little appreciation of the conditions he and others were facing in the provinces. At this point, Mao was not only dismissed from party posts, but demoted in his own army. However, he was quickly reinstated. Mao, forever his own man, could see a way forward. He predicted that the white forces would continue to fight among themselves and that the communists could use this to their advantage, rather than focusing their energies on encouraging and supporting peasant insurrections, which would most likely collapse once the Red Army left. He argued that they should instead consolidate the revolution in the areas where strong mass movements had been developed by communists during the Northern Expedition. This was the thinking that enabled the communists to survive Jinggangshan, survive the Shaanxi Soviet, the Long March, and Yan'an. It would require a strong communist party to organize them and lead them, and a Red Army to defend them. But it would be done. However, in 1928, the debate surrounding the Red Army's role, the tactics it should adopt, and even the direction the revolution should take, raged on.